So my talk today is going to be on water quality and ecology, and I thought how I'd go about doing this. I thought I'd talk about over the last 25, 30 years, and the emphasis over that period, the changes that have occurred there that may have influenced water quality, some of the monitoring programs and monitoring examples, and questions around whether the monitoring is fit for purpose. And the reason for my emphasis on monitoring is that apart from being quite passionate about monitoring, I think it's crucial that we have monitoring in order to, I guess, quantify and qualify the types of water quality issues we have around the region. And without it, we sort of flounder a wee bit. And I think we all monitor either ourselves as individuals, either consciously or subconsciously. You may not realise it, but I think it's happening all the time. So you gain your own appreciation for the sort of environment you're living in, whether it's better today than it was yesterday or last year. I mean, a classic example being freshwater ecology. Every time I drive over a river bridge, I always look down at the river. It doesn't matter, I can't help it. It's you shouldn't pass me when I'm driving on the bridge because I'm looking the wrong way. But it's just one of those things, you know, the Tokomarero River, which runs State Highway 1 south of Milton. I always look at that river and I can see little macrophytes growing in the water there, and I know what the water level's like relative to when I last saw it. I know how clean or dirty it looks relative to when I saw it a year ago, and all those sorts of things. And they all, they process away in your brain, and you build up an appreciation, I guess, of your own environment. And I think that's all important. As I was going to get to shortly in my talk about different types of monitoring, and I think citizen monitoring, for want of a better word, is as important as regional monitoring and consent monitoring. So very briefly, I've lived in Otago since the early 70s, so nearly 45 years, and there's even a few people here I went to school with, which is scary. So I came to Dunedin to attend university in 1971, and after university, extended time there, I applied for a job at the Otago Regional Council with the grandiose title of Senior Pollution Control Officer. So that was essentially a water quality officer role, largely revolved around resource consent processing and dealing with pollution complaints. And at that time, the RMA was just being enacted and was about to be unleashed on regional and local authorities. And so it was a big learning curve for us all, least of all someone whose appreciation of legislation was limited, to say the least. And to give you an idea of the thinking of the day, and this is not trying to be disparaging in any way, the key question I had to answer, at least I think it was, in my job interview was, what does BOD stand for? So fortunately, I'd been advised by well-informed sources to expect this type of question, and here I am today. But the key response was to emphasise that the B stood for biochemical and not biological. So there is quite a strict sort of code, I think, in terms of how we went about water quality in those days. And it has shifted on from there, but it was very, shall we say, engineering type of approach in terms of treatment plants. You know, if you can produce a treatment of an effluent that's treated to a certain level of BOD, of suspended solids and fecal coliforms, then that treatment plant's working and more or less able to discharge to the environment. Little less regard for the effects on the receiving environment. I might be being a bit unfair on that, but I think that was where it was kind of at in those days. So when I started looking at all the massive regional monitoring data that I've accumulated over the last 25 plus years or so, I had a bit of a panic attack, as there's so much of it I could pull out. But the problem is that you can't look at monitoring data in isolation. It has to have context. And without context, it's just numbers, and you can't interpret it in a meaningful way. At least I don't think you can. And that can take some time and care. So I'll show you some examples in a minute, but I wanted to emphasise from the outset the importance of analysing water quality data and ecological data, knowing as many facts and as many variables that may influence water quality and ecosystems. And let's be honest, quite often we don't know enough about those variables. So that's one of my excuses for not going too heavy on data presentation today. So just going back over the timeline for 25 years, as I alluded to above, the focus on regional water quality issues in those days was, as I recall, primarily on point source discharges and other sundry matters such as incidental pollution spills, and a lot of those I attended in my brief stint at the Regional Council, and I think the majority of them, if not all of them, were spills into urban stormwater systems, and from there either into freshwater or coastal waterways. And if I recall correctly, there was no state of the environment monitoring as we know it today, certainly no regional ecological monitoring whatsoever. Most routine water quality and to a lesser extent ecology data was collected in relation to consent conditions associated with point source discharges. And in the case of the Dunedin coastline, because Dunedin City's municipal sewage outfalls are to the coast and are significant point source discharges in their own right, this meant a good deal of the coastline was and still is monitored for consent purposes. And to my knowledge, there's very little other coastline monitoring, including state of the environment monitoring. The emphasis on consent monitoring has traditionally been around fecal bacteria, ammonia because of its toxicity effects, oxygen demanding substances, that's where the BOD comes into it, sediment, heavy metals and nutrients in the water column. But there's also been a focus on shoreline and subtidal ecology and on metals and fecal contamination of intertidal mussel populations. So here I'm talking about the Dunedin coastline in particular. So in the past, so that's the early 1990s, monitoring of inland waters was for similar purposes, that is monitoring of surface waters in and around point source discharges. But in more recent times, an emphasis on water allocation and water quality activities related to rural land use activities has resulted in a change in emphasis to monitoring the local and cumulative effects of non-point source discharges, largely from agriculture. So again, though, the monitoring of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment and fecal bacteria have been the prime focus. Ecological indicators, so moving away from strictly water quality parameters for flowing waters, are focused around, in the case of inland waters, benthic macroinvertebrate populations and periphyton or algae cover and biomass, and occasionally fish populations are monitored, but typically to a lesser extent. And I think the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management has largely followed those themes. So even in the early 1990s, there was a concern around the effects of urban and industrial stormwater, and I recall being involved in some urban stormwater initiatives for Dunedin City, including the production of educational pamphlets and even a stint on the local TV channel. And there's some painting of yellow fish next to stormwater drain outlets, but that's about where it ended. There was, however, a significant initiative in developing what was called a planning study for Otago Harbour. So this was a cooperative project undertaken by the ORC and the DCC in 1991 and included involvement from DOC and other stakeholders. And I even managed to find the original documents in our basement at work yesterday and photographed the cover because there's no PDFs in those days. And there's about 6 or 7 different reports produced from that, including a pollution report, which I was a convener of that group. And the point of raising this project, even though it was, I don't know how many years ago now, it was 25 plus years ago, was to reflect on some of the recommendations in relation to water quality, which I thought was a useful exercise in the context of this forum. So it's not specifically an exercise to focus on just on Otago Harbour, but to consider whether the thinking of the day is in any way still applicable to the wider issues of point and non-point source discharges as we face today. So I was interested to know, and I thought you might also, to see if the recommended objectives in the pollution report, which I was a convener of, as I mentioned, had been followed through in any way, or whether they were still of a relevance to today's water quality issues, and I'll come back to those later. There have been changes over time, and I think it's important to acknowledge these that may have influenced water quality. and I'm focusing here primarily on point source discharges. So there's been a large number of upgrades to sewage treatment plants, particularly in the Dunedin area. So you've got, for example, the Green Island sewage treatment plant treatment upgrade and extended ocean outfall, and then that followed with the Tahuna sewage treatment plant upgrades and extended ocean outfall 1,100 metres offshore. There were 4 sewage outfalls that discharged directly into Otago Harbour, and they are now all reticulated to Tahuna sewage treatment plant. Oamaru's wastewater has undergone upgrades in the last 25 years with some land-based treatment as well. Meraki used to be all septic tanks when I worked at the Regional Council, and that now has a treatment system with UV and then discharge into a constructed wetland. Balclutha wastewater used to discharge directly into the Clutha River when I lived there. Has now got oxidation pond treatment and a mid-river diffuser. Silver Fern's Finnegan Freezing Works discharged to the Clutha River, has undergone upgrades, has a mid-river diffuser. Similar for Fonterra Stirling on the other branch of the Clutha. Alliance Pukuri has had some upgrades. Hawea Township's effluents irrigated to land, and Queenstown Wanaka wastewaters have been subject of ongoing treatment upgrades. So there's a lot of things have changed that probably have influenced local water quality. There's also other factors such as waste streams into those treatment plants. So for example in Dunedin, we've lost the Burnside Meatworks out in Kaikoura Valley, which was a significant point source of organic waste stream to Green Island. There's been a number of tanneries over the years that have closed down. There's the Sawyers Bay one that's no longer there, although its legacy in Sawyers Bay Harbour still remains, I think. The tannery at Logan Park's gone. It used to have a discharge that got into the water of Leith, and a tannery at Green Island as well. And a number of other trade waste contributions have diminished as times have changed, I suppose. There's also a large number of landfills throughout the region which have closed or been capped or have been subject to better leachate containment. So looking at the monitoring emphasis, so I regard there's 2 main forms of monitoring that we're constantly, I suppose, exposed to, and use the data that's gained from these for seeing what the state of our environment's like. So there's monitoring associated with point source discharges, and these are associated largely with primary and municipal industry discharges, municipal discharges. And for the significant number of these, particularly the larger ones, these have typically resulted in extensive and long-term data sets, which I consider have been extremely valuable in terms of being able to track changes in water quality over time. Then there's the Regional Council State of the Environment Monitoring, which has come into being, I suppose, in the last 15, 20 years or so. There has been a change in emphasis in regional monitoring, I guess with more emphasis, and this is my own view anyway, on non-point source discharges, so looking at a regional-wide perspective, water quality trends in relation to catchment land use activities, and perhaps less focus on some of the urban environments and very little on the coastal environment. But there's another layer of monitoring which I think is very important and we should all be aware of and not disregard, and that's sort of informal and ad hoc monitoring associated with stakeholder groups and citizens and research institutions. For example, DOC historically have done quite a bit of monitoring of regional freshwater fish populations which are regarded as being at risk or threatened. Fish and Game monitor sports fisheries and licence numbers and also undertake some resource monitoring as well. Licence holders often comment about how they regard the state of the environment in their local waterways because they're always, or frequently a lot of them are out there and get a good feel for how they think the water should look like or taste like. And there's university research projects and investigations associated mainly with the University of Otago, and I think we can thank those investigations for identifying issues such as lake snow, that's an obvious example, but also lake blooms and other issues like that. So there's a whole multitude of monitoring components. So a few examples, and I thought I'd use the Dunedin City Council's sewage outfall monitoring program as the best example of long-term data and data which can demonstrate an obvious change in the receiving water environment associated with a change in a point source discharge. So because Green Island outfall is somewhere here, so here, and Blackhead is around about here. Monitoring has typically taken place right from Akatoa up to Victory Beach on a punch, which is roughly 60 kilometres, and a number of sites in between there. Some of those I've been associated with and my colleagues have over a number of years. And a range of different parameters are monitored in terms of the water quality, so emphasis on fecal bacteria, and then there's some sediment monitoring for heavy metals. There's also shellfish monitoring, which is what I wanted to focus on. So shellfish have been monitored right up the coastline, sort of at quarterly or 6-monthly intervals for a large number of years now, looking at fecal contamination and also heavy metals. So what does it tell us? Well, this is just a quick graph showing enterococci, type of fecal bacteria at Loy's Head, and you can see how there's some quite large spikes in concentrations up to around about early 2013, but since that time they have dropped away quite significantly and consistently low or lowish since the upgrades have taken place. Delving it into a bit more detail, so here this is the fecal coliform counts in the seawater along the coastline before and after the Tahuna wastewater treatment plant upgrade, and you can see particularly there were typically very high levels around Lawyers Head and around the Dunedin beaches there prior to the upgrades. Following the upgrades, very significant decreases. These are just mean numbers, but I think they do reflect the consistency of reduction in numbers throughout the monitoring period since the upgrade.
Greg, could you just highlight the green bars, which people may not be able to see as clearly?
Okay, I'm colourblind, but I'll do my best.
Oh.
So green bars are these ones here, and orange, the big ones typically. So these are the fecal coliform counts in mussel flesh. Again, quite a substantial change in mean concentrations in the shellfish flesh following the upgrade. Again, you can hardly see the yellow bars in this case, being post-treatment upgrades. And interestingly, they are reduced further up the coastline, certainly than I would have anticipated. Whether that's due solely to the upgrades or not is difficult to say, but there must be some contribution there going on. Remembering, of course, that southern current is moving sort of south to north, sweeping around the Otago Peninsula. And this is the enteroviruses in mussel flesh as well. And again, it's a similar story. Counts relatively high or quite high prior to treatment upgrades. Following upgrades, with a 0 here at the outfall area and low numbers further up coast, if you like. So, example of consent monitoring, very useful. It's taken a lot of work. This is not just based on a few counts. There's a lot of data in that, and you could explore it more if you wanted to. But don't have time today. This is just a quick and not a very good slide, I have to apologise, of beach bathing monitoring program Regional Council undertakes. But I thought this time I'd look at the lakes. Again, focusing around the urban areas. So we've got to my far side, it's Lake Harbour at the Holiday Park. So these are median numbers. These lines here, the main spread of data is these blocks, and the outliers you can see with the asterisks. So Harbour shows it's consistently very good water quality in terms of E. coli numbers. The odd occasional elevated number, but really it's not too bad against health guidelines. When you get into Lake Wakatipu, Frankton Bay, so it's more of an enclosed arm. It's a bigger urban population. You've got more urban stormwater runoff. So perhaps not surprisingly, the median level is higher than say Harbour. Still only 10, which is pretty good. You're not going to fall over if you swim in it. But they do get occasional very high level up into the hundreds. So Wanaka, Lake Wanaka at Wanaka Township. Again, median level is very low, but you do get occasional very high spikes. Again, it's more than likely to be related to urban stormwater runoff. And then finally Lake Hayes at Mill Creek, very low medium level. Some highish numbers. That's probably more related to runoff from the rural catchment. So as an example of regional monitoring, McAndrew Bay, this is one regional council monitoring site. I'm not going to talk about that too much because it's just scattered all over the show, except to say that, and we used to take our kids down here, but there are some very high numbers. You wouldn't want to be swimming or recreating around there when the numbers are getting up into that category, especially on a regular basis. So another urban stream, Dunedin Stream, Kaikorai Stream, Brighton Road. This is just dissolved reactive phosphorus very quickly over a good number of years now. You can see how there's a reduction here in this time. And that's one of the values of long-term monitoring. You start to see trends, and it starts you thinking, well, why is that occurring? Is it land use, urban change? Is it the source water for Kaikorai Stream, which happens to include water from the deep stream catchment, overflow water? That's part of the city water treatment or potable water supply. Number of questions though about why suddenly you get blips and why is there a low patch here, and you have to look at, it's why you can't look at data in isolation. You need to look at a whole lot of other things like what's happening with rainfall. Kaikorai Stream has been subject to accidental, shall we say, pollution spills for a number of years now, so that there are often blips that may be due to that sort of activity. And this is just nitrate nitrogen for the same site. Again, quite high numbers in the past, and still high on occasions, but consistently more low in recent years. So very quickly, and I know I'm over time, I wanted to go back to this document and just have a look at some of the recommendations that were made in the working group and see whether you know, whether I know, whether they've proceeded in any way or changed. The first one was a need for a comprehensive, coordinated long-term water quality and environmental monitoring program for the whole of Otago Harbour. To my knowledge, that hasn't really been undertaken. There's monitoring of various types there, but hasn't been coordinated in my view anyway. I'll skip 2, that's not quite relevant here. I think 3 is interesting. Steps be undertaken or be taken to ensure that harbour sewage treatment plants achieve their design performance and long-term be given to improving their quality or eventual elimination, and that has happened. So that's an outcome that's been achieved. There's a recommendation related to septic tanks. It's more of a sort of an educational one there, about educating people about how their septic tanks should operate to avoid local effects. The fifth one, that City Council will be encouraged to continue their current program on sewage and stormwater separation. I think that's fair to say that's occurring or has occurred in fits and starts, but not completed. I think we can skip 6. 7, restrict discharges of sewage and industrial contaminants into poorly flushed areas of the harbour, and that sewage outfall location at Sewage Bay be reviewed. Well, that's been achieved. This is an interesting one, it's quite relevant here, that the Regional Council and City Councils, as a long-term objective, strive to improve the quality of urban stormwater by treatment, control of pollution discharges into the stormwater system, and improving public education. So it'd be interesting to get views on people whether that objective's been, or recommendations been followed through in any way. I think we'll skip 9, it's specific to Ravensdown. This is an interesting one, number 10, classifying waters in some areas of Otago, in particular the waters around in Otago, should have a class status for water being managed for the gathering of and cultivating of shellfish for human consumption. So interesting to see whether there's been any moves along those lines. Skip 11. 12, again, it's another public education one. Campaigns on pollution continue, and I guess that's occurred to varying degrees. So finally, just questions for moving forward. The questions I'm really interested in knowing about, because I see a strong link between water quality and monitoring. They go very much hand in hand. So have our monitoring programs adequately identified the relevant issues of today? Is it still fit for purpose? What does monitoring, that doesn't make sense. What does monitoring tell us? What doesn't it tell us? Are there any obvious gaps? And can we rely on it for planning purposes? What are the benefits of consent-related monitoring versus that of SOE type monitoring? Are they compatible with SOE monitoring and reasonable with respect to the potential effect of the discharge? So the weight on the, how much weight should we be putting on the consent holder in terms of their monitoring responsibilities? And finally, is it reasonable to expect our monitoring programs to detect potential water quality issues of the immediate future, it should say. So has it helped us predict issues like Didymo, lake snow and cyanobacteria blooms? There's probably a bit of debate around that, but by and large, monitoring can't predict every potential water quality issue. They have to focus on what are obvious issues, but we also need to be prepared for sort of unanticipated type issues such as, say, Didymo and lake snow. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.
So final slide.
Oh, this was a question. Can we work that? There's a video. No, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
That's an outfall in a river in Otago. What it does show is the outfall doing its business, but also a large number of trout just hanging in the column here. Quite nice condition fish as well. And I just wanted to show that point source discharges aren't always bad news. They can provide habitat for some species, and they seem to do quite well right around them. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.